The year was 1878, and the Blue Ridge Mountains were bleeding the colors of autumn. To the locals of Deep Creek, North Carolina, Duncan MacLeod was an enigma wrapped in a tattered wool coat. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were thick with the rolling R's of the Scottish Highlands, a sound as rugged as the crags of his homeland. Duncan had claimed a small, steep plot of land that no one else wanted. Too rocky, the neighbors said. Too much wind, they warned. But Duncan saw something they didn't: the way the sun hit the granite shelf and the way the trees stood as silent sentinels against the northern gale. While the other settlers, men like Silas Thorne, who had lived in the hollow for 3 generations, built their cabins with massive central fireplaces that dominated the main wall, Duncan spent his first month just staring at a corner. He cleared a space where the north and east walls would meet, and there, he began to dig. Silas rode by one afternoon, his horse huffing in the cooling air. "Duncan, you're putting the hearth in the corner. You'll crack your foundation, man. A fireplace belongs in the center, to hold the house together. You're building a ruin, not a home." Duncan didn't look up from the stones he was sorting. "A center fire warms the air, Silas. A cornerstone warms the bones. I'm no building for the center of the room, I'm building for the heart of the mountain." As the first frost glazed the hemlocks, Duncan's folly took shape. Unlike the flat-backed fireplaces of his neighbors, Duncan's hearth was set at a precise 45-degree angle. He spent weeks hauling river stones and heavy granite slabs. He didn't just build a firebox, he built a thermal battery. The stone mass didn't stop at the chimney, it extended deep into both the north and east walls, creating a massive L-shaped wing of masonry that disappeared behind the log siding. The neighbors gathered at the general store to gossip. "He's wasting good stone," muttered Elias, the local blacksmith. "Most of that heat is going to be sucked right out into the dirt. He'll be freezing by Christmas." But Duncan was following the ancient logic of the Scottish croft houses. In the Highlands, wood was a luxury and peat was precious. You didn't waste heat by letting it escape through a thin back wall. You trapped it. You forced the fire to talk to the stone, and the stone to talk to the house. By late November, the cabin was enclosed. Duncan's fireplace looked wrong to the American eye. It squinted across the room from its corner perch. However, the first time he lit a match to a handful of dry pine shavings, the fire didn't struggle. While the central fireplaces in the hollow often coughed smoke back into the rooms when the wind shifted, Duncan's corner position created a natural vortex. The angled firebox acted like a lens, reflecting infrared heat, the kind of heat that hits your skin like a physical weight, straight into the center of the living space. But the real magic was invisible. As the fire roared, the granite wings extending into the walls began to drink the heat. The temperature of the stones rose slowly, steadily. While Silas Thorne was constantly throwing heavy oak logs onto his fire to keep his drafty cabin at a meager 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Duncan was sitting in his shirt sleeves, burning nothing but a few scraps of alder and birch. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper that froze the blood. By mid-December, the Appalachian sky had turned the color of bruised slate. The wind, funneling through the gaps in the ridges, carried a fine, needle-like snow that bypassed even the tightest window seals. In the hollow, the other settlers retreated to their hearths. Silas Thorne's cabin was a masterpiece of traditional design, yet it was failing him. His massive central fireplace was a glutton for wood. He threw oak and hickory into its maw until his arms ached, but the laws of thermodynamics were cruel. The soaring heat created a powerful vacuum, sucking cold air through the floorboards and cracks in the walls. While the air 3 feet from the fire was scorching, the water in the bucket by the door was skimmed with ice. Meanwhile, at the edge of the rocky shelf, Duncan MacLeod's cabin stood like a silent sentinel. To the passing eye, it looked underfueled. Only a thin, steady ribbon of pale smoke curled from his chimney. He wasn't feeding a roaring beast, he was maintaining a glowing heart. On the second night of the blizzard, the temperature plummeted to 30 below. The timber of the cabins groaned and popped like pistol shots as the sap froze and expanded. Silas, fearing for his youngest daughter's health, decided to check on the Scotsman, half expecting to find a frozen corpse. When he struggled through the drifts and reached Duncan's door, he didn't even have to knock. The door swung open, and he was met not by a blast of cold, but by a wall of deep, thrumming warmth. "Come in, Silas," Duncan said, his voice calm. He was wearing only a light wool tunic, his sleeves rolled up. Silas stepped inside and gasped. The cabin was dim, lit only by a modest bed of coals in the corner hearth. But the air felt different. It was heavy, still, and profoundly warm. It wasn't the dry, scorched air of Silas's home. It felt like the warmth of a summer afternoon trapped in stone. "Where is your fire, man?" Silas demanded, shivering as the ice melted off his beard. "You've barely a handful of embers in there." "The fire is done for the night, Silas," Duncan replied, patting the wall adjacent to the fireplace. "But the stone is just beginning its work." Duncan guided Silas's hand to the wooden logs of the interior wall, nearly 5 feet away from the hearth. To Silas's shock, the wood was warm to the touch. Behind the logs, the massive granite wings Duncan had buried into the structure were radiating stored energy back into the room. "You see," Duncan explained softly, "your fireplace is a chimney with a fire in it. Mine is a mountain that I've taught to hold the sun. By placing it at the 45-degree angle in the corner, I've turned the very cornerstones of this house into a battery. I burn half the wood because I don't let the heat escape. I invite it to stay in the walls." Silas looked at the modest pile of alder wood in the corner. It was enough to last Duncan a week. In his own yard, Silas had a cord of wood that would be gone by morning. As the storm intensifies, the strange engineering of the Scotsman becomes the valley's only hope. The blizzard reached its crescendo on the third night. The wind was no longer a whistle, it was a rhythmic battering ram that shook the very foundations of the hollow. In Silas Thorne's cabin, the battle was being lost. The central chimney, despite the roaring fire, had become a cold well. The heavy masonry was so chilled by the external wind that it was now pulling more heat out of the room than the flames could provide. Silas gathered his wife and 3 children. Wrapped in every blanket they owned, they looked like ghosts moving through the whiteout. They struggled 300 yards to the rocky shelf where Duncan's cabin sat. When they burst through the door, the contrast was staggering. Duncan was sitting at a small table, reading a book by candlelight. The air was a steady, balmy 74 degrees Fahrenheit. "My wood is gone, Duncan," Silas wheezed, collapsing into a chair. "The fire it wouldn't take. We're freezing." Duncan didn't offer pity, he offered hot tea and a place by the wall. "Sit against the corner, Silas. Let the stone speak to your back." As the Thorne family huddled against the interior walls, they felt it, a deep, infrared pulse of heat. It wasn't the flickering, inconsistent heat of a flame, but a solid, vibrating warmth coming from the granite hidden behind the timber. As the night wore on, other neighbors arrived, Elias the blacksmith and Old Man Miller. Duncan's cabin, though small, became the warm heart of the hollow. With 15 people inside, the temperature didn't drop. If anything, the human heat was now being absorbed by the walls alongside the fire's energy. Elias, being a man of craft, couldn't help but inspect the hearth. "I've seen 1,000 fireplaces, MacLeod. But this, the way you've angled the firebox, it's like a mirror." Duncan nodded. "In the Highlands, we call it the leader logic. If the fire sits flat against a wall, half the radiation is absorbed by the back stone and sent straight up the flue. But at 45 degrees, the radiation cross-pollinates. The left side reflects to the right reflects to the left. The heat is forced to bounce into the room before it can find the chimney." He pointed to the base of the hearth. "And because it's in the corner, I've used the Earth's own insulation. The 2 exterior walls meeting here create a pocket. I'm not heating the outdoors, I'm heating the skeleton of the house." Thermal measurements, had they possessed the tools of the future, would have shown a staggering 20-degree advantage. While the other cabins were wasting 80% of their fuel to the sky, Duncan was capturing 70% of it in the masonry. When the sun finally broke through the clouds the following morning, the hollow was buried under 4 feet of snow. But the strange cabin on the hill was the only one where no one was shivering. The neighbors stepped outside to see the most telling sign of all. On the roofs of the other cabins, the snow had melted near the chimneys, a sign of wasted heat escaping. On Duncan's roof, the snow sat thick and undisturbed right up to the flue. The heat wasn't on the roof, it was in the room. Silas Thorne looked at his own cold, dark home and then back at Duncan. "We called you a fool for building at an angle, Duncan. But it seems we were the ones standing crooked." The week following the Great Freeze was not spent in celebration, but in study. The men of the hollow, once skeptical and mocking, now followed Duncan MacLeod like disciples. They didn't come with advice anymore, they came with measuring tapes and charcoal to take notes. Duncan spent his days in the charred remains of Silas's woodpile, explaining the geometry of the hearth. "You see," he said, drawing lines in the soot on the floor, a central fireplace is a lonely thing. It fights the cold from all sides. But a corner hearth uses the walls as its shield and its reservoir. He showed Elias the blacksmith how to forge smaller, angled grates that fit the 45-degree firebox. He taught them about thermal lag, the principle that a heavy stone wall takes hours to heat up, but once it does, it radiates warmth for an entire day, even after the last ember has turned to ash. The neighbors began to retrofit their cabins. It was back-breaking work, tearing out the flat backs of their chimneys to build the MacLeod wings into the corners. But the memory of the 3-day blizzard was fresh, and the fear of the cold was a powerful motivator. By the following winter, the MacLeod Corner had become the trademark of the Deep Creek settlement. Travelers passing through the Blue Ridge Mountains began to notice a peculiar thing. In this one specific hollow, the woodpiles were half the size of anywhere else, yet the people seemed healthier, their homes drier and warmer. Word spread of the Scottish angle. Duncan's measurement of the 18 to 22 degree temperature advantage wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a proven fact of Appalachian survival. He had introduced a piece of the old world, the Highland croft logic, and grafted it onto the rugged American timber. Epilogue. The hearth of the mountain. Decades passed. The original log cabins eventually gave way to framed houses, and the Great Depression, the same one Nora Lindquist would later fight in her own way, loomed on the horizon. But in that small corner of Washington state in the hills of North Carolina, the legacy of Duncan MacLeod remained. Architects would later visit the ruins of the MacLeod cabin, marveling at the masonry. They would find that even after 100 years, the granite cornerstones held a structural integrity that central chimneys lacked. Duncan MacLeod died an old man, warm in his bed, with a very small fire flickering in the corner of his room. He hadn't built a monument to himself. He had simply looked at a corner, seen the potential for warmth, and decided that in a world of straight lines and cold winds, the most beautiful thing a man could build was a perfect, purposeful angle. The legacy, a century of warmth. Years turned into decades, and the settlement of Deep Creek evolved from a collection of desperate cabins into a thriving mountain town. While other pioneer techniques faded into history books, the MacLeod angle became a local law of physics. In the early 1920s, a young engineer named Thomas Miller, the grandson of the Old Man Miller, who had sheltered in Duncan's cabin during the Great Freeze, returned to the hollow with instruments of modern science. He was armed with early thermal sensors and a desire to prove why the Scotsman's hearth worked so much better than the standard American designs. The scientific revelation. Thomas's findings were startling. In his report to the State Engineering Board, he noted 3 specific anomalies in the MacLeod design. The vortex effect. Because the fireplace was tucked into a 45-degree corner, the wind hitting the exterior of the house actually created a positive pressure zone that stabilized the draft. Unlike central chimneys that choked during heavy gusts, Duncan's hearth pulled oxygen with perfect, rhythmic precision. The thermal battery. Thomas discovered that the granite wings Duncan had buried into the walls acted as a phase change material. They didn't just get hot, they stored heat at a molecular level. His measurements confirmed a 21-degree Fahrenheit differential between the corner-style homes and the traditional ones during the night hours. Radiation cross-pollination. Thomas observed that the angled firebox acted like a parabolic mirror. Instead of the heat traveling in a straight line toward the opposite wall, it crisscrossed the room, warming the air through multiple reflections before rising to the ceiling. The final lesson. As the world entered the era of central heating and electricity, the physical cabins Duncan built began to crumble. However, his philosophy remained. In the 1970s, during the global energy crisis, architects looked back at the Appalachian corner hearth as a blueprint for passive solar heating and high-efficiency wood stoves. Duncan MacLeod hadn't just built a fireplace, he had understood the relationship between mass and energy. He knew that wood was a temporary fuel, but stone was a permanent storage. Today, if you hike through the deep woods of the Blue Ridge, you might find a lonely pile of stones standing in a clearing. If you look closely, you'll see they aren't piled in a flat line. They are set at a sharp, purposeful 45-degree angle, still holding the memory of a man who knew how to turn a cold corner into a warm heart. Subscribe for more true survival stories.